Hello everyone, my name is Ashish and welcome to the Xadmin channel. So today we are going to discuss the topic what happens when a Spring Boot starts or what is the internal flow of a Spring Boot application or a project. So this is the one of the important topic which you may can get in a Spring Boot interview question. So as a developer, we hardly bother what happens when we start our Spring Boot application, right? So only we deals with by writing our controller class or a service class or a model class or a repository, right? We hardly bother that what happens internally when we start a Spring Boot application. So today we are going to discuss that what happens internally, how the Spring Boot flow. So yeah, so like as I told you that everyone who has created a new Spring Boot application knows you will end up with a runnable main method that launches a Spring Boot magic, but we hardly care what happens inside the hood. So today we will discuss the same. So this is the main class as we have seen with the at the rate Spring Boot application annotation. And here the main method is there. So inside the main method, a run method is called, right? So as the parameter, we pass our project name or this class, right? So this is the main method from where our application get start. So we are going to see now what happens when we start the Spring Boot application. So, so, and we run the man method, and then suddenly our Tomcat server boots up, right? So here the application.property file get read in, and then you immediately start writing your controller service and like model and all other classes, right? So now we will see how does this internally work. So basically the Spring does not generate any code automatically and not using any XML configuration file for the setup or for the auto configure. And as we know that Spring Boot main feature is a auto configuration part, right? So Spring uses internally the configuration done by a Spring Boot developer and that are provided in a form of jar. So as a developer, we don't do any setup. The Spring Boot developer has already done the setup and they have provided that classes combined in a jar and they have provided to us. So only Spring uses that pre-configured jar and those jar is available inside META-INF slash spring factories file. So which we are going to see further in this lecture. So to enable the pre-configured jar, we need to define the dependencies in a pom.xml, right? So inside the pom.xml, if we are using the maven, then inside the pom.xml, we define the dependencies or the component which we are going to use in our Spring Boot application, right? So let's say that I want to use Spring Data JPA. So for that, I need to add these dependencies in my pom.xml, right? So these dependencies will be loaded all the jars related JPA repository and store in a Spring Factories file. So the Spring will load all the jars related to these dependencies and then it will store in a spring.factory file. So here we can see the spring.factory file also. So this is our, let's say, a Spring Boot application. So if I will extend this, then here you can see our Maven dependencies, right? So here all the jars are loaded inside this folder. So there will be one jar with the name auto configure. So let me search that jar. Yeah, so this is a Spring Boot auto configure jar. So inside this jar, there will be more folders like auto configure admin, AOP, batches, sketches. So all these folders are handling the particular component which we are using, right? So inside this auto configure jar, this jar is basically handles the auto configuration of a Spring Boot. So inside this jar, we have a META-INF, and here we have a Spring Factories file. So here the all the classes are defined here, right? So here you can see for the initializer, here is the application context initializer. And also if you're using the application listener, then this is the application listener is maintained here. And also and also these are the auto configure files which are inserted inside this spring factories file, right? So this is the enable auto configuration. And if you are using the cache, then it will cache auto configuration, right? So all these auto configurations already defined inside our spring.factories file. And this is for like gndi connection factory, and this is the data source auto configuration, right? So these are the files already mentioned in the spring.factories file. And this is a wave mbc auto configuration, right? So from here the spring reads this auto configuration and do the setup, right? So here the all the dependencies of this jpa repository get added or loaded inside spring.factories file. So now, so now there are the two annotations which play a vital role for the auto configuration. First is the @conditional, and second @configuration. So these are the two auto like these are the two annotations which are most important. First, @conditional on bean and @conditional on class. So @conditional on bean will search for the data source bean. If it is available, then only it will enable the jp repository auto configuration. Otherwise it will not do the auto configuration. So first it will check by the condition on this bean. If this data source is present, then only it will start a JP repository auto configuration. So in the same way, there is another like annotation with that there conditional on class. And here we are writing JP repository.class, right? So it will search for the JP repository class. If it is available, then only it will enable the JP repository auto configuration. So these are the two example I have like given. So there are many n number of like conditional on class like annotations are defined inside the spring.factory file. So from where our spring reads and check this condition, and if the condition matches, then it starts our auto configuration. So all these conditions are true, then only it will enable the JP repository auto configuration class for this example, right? So if all the conditions are satisfied, then only Spring will enable this component. So this is just an example. I have taken the example of a JP repository. So in the same way, the other components or the dependencies are configured in a Spring. So the summary is that when the Spring Boot boots up, it tries to read dot properties from the 17 hard-coded locations as we have seen in the jar, and it also reads in the spring.factories file of your auto configure module and find out which auto configure it should evaluate, right? So it will evaluate only those configurations or the component or the dependencies which are defined in a pom.xml file. Now it has an enhanced concept of at the rate conditionals and compared to the plain Spring. As I said that at the rate conditionals and at the rate configuration, two annotations are most important and play a vital role for the auto configuration part. So now how the Tomcat auto configuration is done. As we know that as a developer, we don't require to start our server, right? So Spring starts the server when we start a Spring Boot application. So how this is done? So first it need to check if the Tomcat is on a class path or not. So it will check with the help of this annotation at the rate conditional on class as we have seen for the JP repository. So this is same for the Tomcat class, right? So here if this find this class then it will start the auto configuration for this Tomcat server. So it might take into the account specific properties of that user set like server.port. So also it can take the values from the application properties file where the server.port is defined, right? It need to take Spring Wave MVC dispatcher servlet and register it with a Tomcat. And we know that our front controller in a Spring is a dispatcher servlet, right? So it will register that dispatcher servlet with a Tomcat because the dispatcher servlet work is to take the request from the client and then process that request. So as a client, we can send a JSON from the browser, or let's say from a postman. So it will go to the controller. So basically the controller will handle, so it will work as a dispatcher servlet. So inside the controller there will be the endpoints, and in the endpoints there will be a request mapping and also the http like methods, let's say a get method or post method. So we have defined, let's say, with at the red get mapping and the post mapping, right? So all this will integrated with the dispatcher servlet. So it need to take Spring Wave MVC display servlet and register it with the Tomcat. Now it need to start our embedded Tomcat server. So here it will start the display servlet and it will start our embedded Tomcat server. So basically the Spring Boot has its own embedded server. They are like Tomcat, which is the default, and the other two are like JT and the Undertow. So how we can like use the other servers, the JT servers? So for that we have to define that JT server inside our pom.xml, right? So we have to remove this Tomcat configuration from the pom.xml, then we have to define our JT or under tau configuration in a pom.xml. Then we can use the other servers also. So Tomcat has three servers: Tomcat, JT, and under tau. So by this way the Tomcat server get started, right? So now we are going to see high level of a Spring Boot or how it's run. So when the run method started, so first it will search for the classes annotated with at the rate configuration. So all those classes will be searched by a Spring, and then it will initialize all that declared beans which are marked with at the rate configuration, and the based on their scopes. So there can be like there are like yeah, so there are like 3 to 4 scopes for a bean class. So it can be singleton, it can be a prototype, it can be a session, right? So if the bean scope is like singleton, then only a single object will be created for that particular bean, and every time that particular object will be used, right? So only one object can be created for that particular bean. So if the scope of the bean is like prototype, then always a new object will be created for that bean, right? So the scope, so according to the scope is initialized, and then according to the scope it stores the bean information or the object in the JVM, and then it stores in a JVM, inside JVM, which is known as IOC container, right? So inside the container, it stores that bean information or the object information according to their scopes. So after the creation of all the beans, automatically the configures the dispatcher servlet and register the default handler mapping. So in a Spring, if you have the knowledge about a Spring, then you might be knowing that there is a dispatcher servlet and handler mapping, and also the message converters and all the other things or the components are there, right? So handler mapping, so all these like display servlet and the handler mapping and the message converters, all these component get registered uh, after the space allocation has done for the bean, right? So this is the high level flow of a Spring Boot. Now we are going to see the internal flow of a run method when the run method starts. So internally, first it will create the application context, and then it will check the application type, then it will register the annotated class bean with the context, and then it will create an instance of a Tomcat embedded servlet container which will add to that context, and then it will deploy our web application or the Spring Boot application as a jar, and then it will start right in that particular server. So this is the internal flow of the run method. So now we are going to see the main class in which our main method is there, right? So in so here, yeah, so I am talking about this class. So in this class, you have seen the main method. So inside the main method, the run method is there, right? So run method starts. So internally, we have seen what things happens like internally. So now we are going to see inside a Spring application dot class, you will find here a run method, right? So inside this method, if you will see, then inside this method, a create application context method is there. So first it will create the application context, and inside create application context method, it will check application type as it is a servlet type or a reactive or a default context type. Based on this, it will return the context. So basically, when the run method runs, it will return the context, right? So it can be a servlet type, it can be a reactive type, it can be a default type. So now in default context class, you will see the class annotation configuration dot class. So these will be the class present inside a default context class, right? So these classes which are annotated with at the red component, at the red service, at the red configuration will be registered to that context, right? So, and in the finally the run method auto deploy the jar or the var to the server, and our application get started, right? So this is the main class I was talking about. So we can see, so this is our main class. So inside this, you can see this is the main and this is the run method, right? So inside the run method, you can see it is returning a run, and here you can see it is returning the new Spring application, right? And here, if you will see, then it will return the context. So here the web application type, it is checking the type, and then with the class dot for name, it is taking the class name, and then it is returning the class object, and with that, yeah, so this is our main class, right? So this is the internal of the run method, which you can go through by yourself, right? So yeah, so like this is all about when the Spring Boot startup. So basically, some main points. When the Spring Boot startups, the run method runs. So then the auto configuration plays a vital role, right? So for that, like whatever we have defined in our pom.xml, first it will be checked in our like spring.factories file. So here all the auto configure file classes are defined. So it will check and it will try to register it. So there are the two annotations like at the rate condition, conditional, and at the rate configuration. So at the rate conditionals will check that whether that classes are present inside that particular class path or not. If it's fine, then it will start the auto configuration. Otherwise, it will not start. Right? So after that, the application context will be created. So with that application context, the dispatcher servlet will be created, and that dispatcher servlet will be registered, because with the dispatcher servlet only the request will be taken, and then that request will be processed, right? And then at the rate configuration, and then at the rate configuration annotation marked with that class will get registered, right? And then it will check for the tomcat class in the class path. If the tomcat class is present, then it will check again the condition with the help of at the rate conditional on class annotation, and then it will check the tomcat class. If that class is present in the class path, then it will start the auto configuration for that tomcat server. And then if there is anything in the application.properties file for that server, then it will pick that properties from there, and then it will register that tomcat server, and then it will start. and after that our whole application will be deployed into that server as a form of jar or a var, and then our application get started. So this is the internal flow of the Spring Boot, right? So in the next lecture, we will see some of the important questions like what is the class annotation at the rate Spring Boot application does, right? And also we will see the Spring Boot starter and all, and also we will see the Spring Actuator and the theme leaf in a very deep manner by doing a practical, right? So thank you and have a nice day. See you in the next lecture.